The chandeliers glittered above, throwing cascades of golden light across the marble floors of the city's most exclusive restaurant. Waiters in white gloves moved with precision, balancing trays of crystal glasses and silver cutlery polished to perfection. The air carried the soft notes of a live violinist, and every guest seemed dressed to impress. It was a night meant for celebration, prestige, and opulence. But in the center of this carefully curated elegance, chaos was about to erupt. Emma sat quietly at a round table draped in velvet, her hand instinctively resting on the curve of her 6-month pregnant belly. She wore a pastel evening dress, simple yet graceful, and around her neck hung a delicate silver necklace. The pendant was old but timeless, her late mother's final gift, the one item Emma refused to remove no matter how often her husband mocked it. Across from her sat Richard, her husband, the celebrated CEO whose name graced business magazines and investor conferences. At 40, he carried himself with the arrogance of a man who believed the world belonged to him. Next to him, far too close, was Vanessa, the striking model everyone whispered about. She laughed lightly at Richard's jokes, touching his arm, sipping her champagne as though Emma were invisible. Emma shifted uncomfortably, her cheeks burning. She wanted to protest, but she had learned the cost of raising her voice. Richard's temper was unpredictable, and tonight, with so many people watching, she thought he might restrain himself. She was wrong. "Richard, this isn't appropriate," Emma finally said, her voice trembling but steady enough to carry across the table. Her fingers clutched the edge of the tablecloth as though it could anchor her dignity. The laughter at the table silenced. Richard turned slowly, his expression hardening. The guests nearby tilted their heads, sensing drama. "Not appropriate?" Richard sneered. "What's not appropriate is you embarrassing me in public. Look at yourself, Emma. Look at that ridiculous necklace you still cling to. Cheap trinkets from your pathetic past." Emma's heart pounded. That necklace was all she had left of her mother, the only reminder of love that never judged or belittled her. Tears pricked her eyes, but she swallowed them back, determined not to give him the satisfaction. She whispered, "It was my mother's. Please don't." Before she could finish, Richard's palm cracked against her cheek. The sound echoed like a gunshot through the hall. Gas rippled across the restaurant. The violinist stopped mid-note. Forks and knives froze above half-eaten plates. Emma's head snapped to the side, her hair spilling across her face. Her hand flew to her belly in shock. The pendant at her neck loosened, the chain snapping under the force. The silver necklace tumbled to the floor, spinning on the marble until it lay still, catching the golden glow of the chandeliers. For a moment, silence reigned. No one dared to breathe. Cameras were raised discreetly. Murmurs spread like wildfire. Then a deep voice broke the stillness. From the entrance, a tall figure appeared. His presence commanded immediate respect, as though the air itself parted for him. Dressed in a tailored suit, with hair silvered by age, but eyes sharp and piercing, he strode toward the center of the chaos. Every guest turned to look, and the waiters instinctively stepped aside. His gaze fell upon the necklace on the floor. His steps faltered. A flicker of recognition crossed his features, and his jaw tightened. "That necklace," he murmured, his voice carrying enough authority to hush the whispers. His eyes lifted to Emma, trembling and wide-eyed. In that instant, the atmosphere shifted. The humiliation that Richard had intended to inflict transformed into a prelude to revelation. No one yet knew the weight of what was about to be said, but the look on the stranger's face promised that this night and Emma's life would never be the same again. Long before the glittering chandeliers and the public humiliation at the restaurant, Emma's life had always been marked by contrasts, fragile beginnings and silent strength. Born to a single mother, she never knew the identity of her father. Whenever Emma asked, her mother would offer only a tired smile and say, "Some truths are too heavy for a child. One day, you'll understand." Her mother worked long hours as a nurse, often returning home exhausted but never forgetting to check Emma's homework, brush back her curls, and kiss her forehead. Their apartment was small, the wallpaper faded, but it was filled with warmth. Emma never felt poor in love. What she did feel was the lingering shadow of absence, a father-shaped void she could never quite name. There was, however, one object that carried a mystery all its own. A delicate silver necklace with a small pendant shaped like a teardrop. Emma's mother kept it hidden in a velvet box, taking it out only on quiet nights. The chain glimmered as though it carried stories older than Emma herself. On her mother's deathbed, weak and fading, she pressed the necklace into Emma's palm. "Promise me," she whispered, her voice trembling. "Never let go of this. It was a gift from a man I once loved with my whole heart. It's all I can give you." Emma promised. From that day forward, she wore it always. At work, at gatherings, even on her wedding day. To her, it wasn't jewelry. It was a shield, a secret piece of her mother's love, and the only connection to a past she didn't fully understand. When she met Richard, she believed fate had finally smiled on her. He was charismatic, successful, and attentive, at least in the beginning. He swept her off her feet with lavish dinners, roses delivered to her office, and whispered promises of a life she never thought possible. Emma, young and hopeful, believed she had found the man who would protect her, the man her mother had wished for her. Their wedding was extravagant, a spectacle covered in society magazines. Yet Emma remembered how Richard had sneered at her necklace as they stood in the dressing room before the ceremony. "You're really going to wear that thing?" he scoffed. "We have a vault full of diamonds, Emma. Why cling to something so cheap?" Emma's cheeks flushed, but she answered softly, "It's all I have left of my mother. It stays." Richard rolled his eyes, already dismissing her words. In that moment, Emma should have recognized the warning, but love has a way of blinding. As months turned into years, the mask Richard once wore began to slip. He traveled constantly, rarely home for dinners. When he was home, his voice was sharp, his eyes cold. Emma's pregnancy, instead of drawing him closer, only pushed him further into the arms of Vanessa, the glamorous model who flaunted her beauty like a crown. Emma endured it all in silence, clinging to the hope that Richard would change once the baby arrived. Each time she touched the necklace at her throat, she drew strength from it. She didn't know why, but she felt that one day it would matter, that one day it would protect her. What Emma could never have imagined was that the necklace was not simply a keepsake. It was the very proof of her bloodline, a symbol of a legacy hidden in plain sight. And soon, the man who once gave it as a token of love would appear, not as a stranger, but as the father she had never known. The fairy tale that Emma once believed in had long since curdled into a nightmare. The Richard she had fallen in love with, the man who once promised her forever, was gone. In his place was someone cold, cruel, and utterly consumed by his own ego. At first, Emma tried to excuse the changes. She told herself that the long hours, the late nights, the short temper were all because of the pressure Richard carried as a CEO. "He's just stressed," she whispered to herself while waiting at the dinner table, food turning cold. "He'll come around." But weeks turned into months, and the pattern only deepened. Richard's absences stretched longer. He no longer offered explanations, and when Emma asked, his answers were sharp, almost mocking. "Stop nagging me, Emma. Do you think you're entitled to my schedule just because you're pregnant? Be grateful I gave you this life." The words cut deeper than any silence ever could. Emma would retreat into the bedroom, one hand resting on her belly, whispering apologies to the unborn child for the storm they had to endure. And then there was Vanessa. At first, Emma heard her name only in rumors. A model Richard had been seen with at events. "It's just business," Richard said when she confronted him, his tone dripping with disdain. But Emma knew better. She saw the lipstick stains on his collars, the perfume that lingered long after he returned home. The cruelest part wasn't the affair itself, it was the way Richard flaunted it. He stopped hiding, bringing Vanessa to public gatherings, treating her as though she were his rightful partner, while Emma stood off to the side. At a charity gala, Emma remembered clutching her necklace like a lifeline as whispers trailed behind her. "That's his wife? She looks so ordinary. Vanessa is stunning. No wonder he left her." The words stung, but Emma kept her chin up, the necklace cool against her skin, reminding her to endure. At home, Richard's contempt only grew bolder. One evening, as Emma set the table, he leaned back in his chair, eyes flicking to the necklace around her neck. "Are you seriously still wearing that thing? You're the wife of a CEO. You should be dripping in diamonds, not clinging to some cheap trinket. It's pathetic." Emma's throat tightened. "It's the only piece of my mother I have left. I won't take it off." Richard's laugh was low and mocking. Your sentimentality makes you weak. No wonder you'll never be more than a burden." Her cheeks burned, but she said nothing. She had learned that silence was safer than resistance. Yet inside, something was breaking. Quietly, piece by piece. As her pregnancy advanced, Emma dreamed of a family dinner where Richard would finally soften, where he would smile as he placed his hand on her belly, excited for the child they created together. But reality crushed her hopes again and again. Instead, Richard was out with Vanessa, their photos splashed across tabloids. The headlines praised them as a power couple, ignoring the pregnant wife hidden at home. Emma's humiliation became public spectacle. By the time the infamous dinner at the luxury restaurant arrived, Emma was already raw with pain. She had begged Richard not to take Vanessa, but he dismissed her with a smirk. "Why should I hide her? She's everything you're not. Beautiful, confident, worthy of me." The words echoed in her ears as she entered the glittering hall, her necklace resting against her chest like a shield. She told herself she could endure anything, for the baby, for the chance that somehow life would turn. But deep down, Emma knew something inside her husband had crossed a line of no return. The night would not end as it began, and as the crowd gathered, unaware of the storm about to break, Emma's silent suffering was about to become a very public tragedy, one that would shock the world and change her life forever. The restaurant was alive with chatter and the soft clink of glasses. Business tycoons, socialites, and politicians filled the velvet-lined booths, trading stories over fine wine and delicacies. To dine here was to announce to the city that you belonged to the elite. At a central table sat Richard, basking in the glow of admiration. Vanessa was glued to his side, her laughter high-pitched, calculated to draw every eye. She wore a sparkling gown that shimmered beneath the chandeliers, the kind of gown designed to outshine everyone else in the room. And it worked, except for the pregnant woman sitting across from them. Emma's pastel dress was understated, her cheeks pale, but her presence still carried a quiet dignity. She had insisted on joining tonight, even though Richard tried to leave her behind. "You'll just embarrass me," he had muttered. Emma knew why he wanted her absent, because Vanessa was always meant to be his centerpiece. As courses arrived and champagne flowed, Richard leaned closer to Vanessa, ignoring Emma entirely. When he finally acknowledged her, it was only to mock. "Look at you, Emma," he said loudly enough for nearby tables to hear. "Dragging that old necklace around like it's worth something. Don't you realize how ridiculous you look? You're a CEO's wife. People expect diamonds, not junk from a pawn shop." Vanessa's laughter rang out like glass shattering. "He's right, darling. If you want to keep up appearances, at least wear something that doesn't scream bargain bin." Emma's fingers instinctively reached for the pendant, pressing it against her chest. The sting of humiliation burned hot, but she forced herself to stay composed. "This necklace belonged to my mother," she whispered. "It's not about money. It's about love." Richard's eyes narrowed, his jaw tightening. "Love?" he scoffed. "What use is love when you're a burden? You think sentimentality will save you? Wake up, Emma. You're nothing but dead weight." Emma's throat tightened, but she didn't back down. "At least I still know the meaning of loyalty. Something you clearly don't." The words cut him sharper than she expected. His face darkened, rage replacing arrogance. Without warning, Richard's hand lashed out. The crack of his palm against Emma's cheek echoed through the hall. Gasps erupted from every direction. Forks clattered onto plates. The violinist stopped mid-song, bow frozen in midair. Emma staggered sideways, her hand cradling her swollen belly. Pain radiated through her face, but worse was the humiliation. Every pair of eyes fixed on her, every phone raised to capture the moment. Then came the sound that would change everything, the delicate snap of a chain breaking. The necklace tumbled down, hitting the marble floor with a soft metallic clang. The pendant spun in a perfect circle, catching the golden light until it stilled in the silence. Richard sneered. "Good riddance. Now maybe you'll learn to let go of that trash." But while Richard gloated, another figure had entered. From the shadows of the entrance, a tall man stepped forward. His presence commanded instant attention, the kind that silenced entire rooms. Dressed in a tailored navy suit, his silver hair glinted beneath the chandeliers. Every guest seemed to recognize him, their whispers dying as quickly as they began. His eyes fell upon the necklace. He froze. For a heartbeat, time itself seemed to stall. His lips parted, a storm of recognition and disbelief flashing across his face. "That necklace," he said, his deep voice carrying through the hall like a bell toll. He stepped closer, each stride steady, unyielding. His gaze shifted to Emma, whose tear-streaked face stared back in shock. The restaurant held its breath. The humiliation Richard had intended to brand upon his wife was unraveling before his eyes. Something greater was stirring, a revelation that would upend everything. And as the stranger reached down, lifting the pendant with trembling fingers, he whispered words that would turn the night upside down. "This belonged to the woman I once loved, which means she is my daughter." The words hung in the air like a thunderclap. "She is my daughter." For a moment, no one moved. No one dared to speak. The clinking glasses, the hum of conversations, the soft notes of the violin, all had evaporated into silence. The glittering restaurant, so full of life seconds before, now felt like a courtroom where judgment had just been passed. Emma's lips parted, but no sound came out. Her heart pounded against her ribs as she stared at the tall man holding her necklace with trembling hands. His eyes, those piercing, steel-gray eyes, were filled with something she had never seen before in any man. Recognition, sorrow, and a father's longing. I don't understand," she whispered, her voice breaking. The man's chest rose and fell as though the weight of decades pressed upon him. "That necklace, I gave it to your mother many years ago. She was the only woman I ever truly loved. And you are the child I never knew I had." Gasps erupted across the restaurant. Phones lifted higher, recording every second of the spectacle. The audience had come for fine dining, but they were witnessing a scandal that would dominate headlines for weeks. Richard's face drained of color. He staggered back, gripping the edge of the table as though it were the only thing holding him upright. What are you talking about?" "That's impossible," he barked, but his voice cracked, betraying his panic. The man's gaze turned sharp as steel. "Impossible? Look at her. Look at her eyes, her face. She is her mother's daughter, and mine." Whispers rippled through the crowd. "Did he say daughter? The billionaire Alexander Grant? Does that mean she's the heir?" Vanessa's manicured hand flew to her mouth. Her carefully painted smile faltered, her composure unraveling. She had thought she was winning, thought Emma was nothing but an obstacle she had already crushed. But now Emma wasn't just a wife. She was the only daughter of a man whose fortune dwarfed Richard's empire. "This is ridiculous," Richard roared, his mask of control shattering. "Emma, tell him he's lying." Emma's hands shook. Tears welled in her eyes as memories of her mother's last words returned. "This was given to me by a man I once loved with all my heart. Never let it go." The truth, long buried, was finally breaking through. She looked from Richard's desperate face to the billionaire's steady gaze. "All this time," she whispered, "I thought I had no father. I thought I was alone." Alexander Grant's voice softened. "You were never alone. I never knew, Emma. If I had, I would have been there every day of your life. But now I am here, and I will never let anyone hurt you again." The crowd erupted, no longer able to hold their astonishment. Some clapped in admiration. Others shook their heads at Richard's downfall. Reporters slipped out to call their editors. What had begun as a night of humiliation was transforming into a public vindication. Richard's knees nearly buckled. His empire, his pride, his carefully cultivated image, all of it was collapsing under the weight of one revelation. He turned to Vanessa, seeking support, but she had already withdrawn her hand, her eyes darting nervously around the room. Emma, still trembling, felt the billionaire's hand on her shoulder, firm, protective, and filled with the promise she had longed for her entire life. For the first time in years, she didn't feel invisible. She didn't feel powerless. She felt like someone who mattered. And Richard, for the first time, realized he had struck not just a woman, not just his wife, but the heir of a billionaire who would stop at nothing to protect her. The revelation had barely left Alexander Grant's lips before the world outside those glittering walls began to change. Guests at the restaurant, their hands trembling with excitement, pressed record and send on their phones. Clips of Richard striking his pregnant wife, the necklace falling, and the billionaire declaring Emma his daughter spread like wildfire across social media. Within minutes, hashtags trended globally. Billionaire heir, CEO exposed, justice for Emma. The once exclusive restaurant transformed into the stage of a scandal that no one could look away from. Emma sat frozen, her cheeks still stinging, her tears glistening under the lights. She clutched her belly protectively, overwhelmed by the weight of what had just happened. The man she had feared and endured for years was unraveling before her eyes, while the father she never knew stood like a shield at her side. Reporters swarmed the entrance within the hour. Paparazzi flashes flooded the night sky. Security guards pushed back the growing mob, but not before dozens of microphones caught sound bites. "Mr. Grant, is she really your daughter?" "Emma, how long have you known?" "Richard, will you apologize for striking your wife?" Richard shoved his way past them, his once proud posture bent and broken. He snapped at the reporters. "This is nonsense. Lies. You'll all regret this." But the desperation in his voice only fueled the frenzy. His carefully polished image as a powerful CEO, the man of control, had shattered with one slap. And the world had seen it. Vanessa trailed behind him, her designer heels clicking frantically against the pavement. She tried to shield her face with her handbag, but the cameras caught everything. The fear in her eyes, the cracks in her perfect facade. For years she had thrived in the glow of Richard's power. Now she looked like a sinking passenger clinging to a ship already capsizing. Back inside, Alexander placed a steadying hand on Emma's shoulder. His voice was calm but resolute. "From this moment forward, no one lays a hand on you. Not him, not anyone. You're my daughter, and I will protect you." Emma swallowed hard, her heart still racing. "I don't even know what this means. I've spent my whole life believing I had no one." Alexander's gaze softened. "It means you'll never stand alone again." By morning, the scandal dominated every headline. News anchors replayed the video in slow motion. The slap, the necklace spinning on the marble, Alexander's booming declaration. Talk shows debated the implications. What does this mean for Richard's company? Will Emma inherit Grant Industries? Stock prices of Richard's firm plummeted by midday. Investors panicked, pulling their support. Shareholders demanded an emergency meeting. Analysts predicted bankruptcy if confidence wasn't restored. For the first time in his career, Richard was no longer seen as untouchable. He was toxic. Meanwhile, Emma became an overnight symbol of resilience. Social media overflowed with support, strangers posting messages like, "Stay strong, Emma. You deserve better. We're with you." The necklace, once mocked, now became a trending symbol of legacy and empowerment. Jewelers across the country even reported a surge in requests for replicas of the Emma pendant. Richard, hiding in his penthouse, screamed at the television as panelists dissected his downfall. "They'll forget. Scandals always fade," he shouted, but his trembling hands betrayed him. He called Vanessa, demanding she stand by him, but her phone went straight to voicemail. The empire he had built on arrogance was collapsing piece by piece, and there was nothing he could do to stop it. And Emma, though still shaken, felt the first flicker of something she hadn't known in years: hope. She had lost so much, endured so much pain. But now, with the truth revealed and the world finally on her side, the tide was turning. The morning after the scandal, Emma awoke in a bed that wasn't her own. The sheets were silk, the ceiling high, and the faint scent of roses drifted through the air. For a moment, she thought she was dreaming. Then she turned her head and saw the view from the penthouse windows. The entire city stretched out below, skyscrapers piercing the clouds. She wasn't in the cramped apartment she had once shared with Richard. She was in Alexander Grant's residence, the home of the man who had just declared her his daughter. Emma sat up slowly, her hand instinctively resting on her belly. The baby kicked lightly, as if reminding her that she wasn't just carrying her own future, but theirs. For the first time in months, maybe years, she felt safe. A knock sounded at the door. When it opened, Alexander entered, not with the imposing presence he had shown the night before, but with the tentative steps of a man afraid of rejection. In his hands was a tray with tea and a small plate of fruit. "I wasn't sure what you liked," he admitted softly, placing it on the nightstand. "I never got the chance to learn." Emma's throat tightened. The man before her wasn't just a billionaire or a public figure. He was the missing piece of her life, the father she had long believed she would never know. "I don't know how to feel," she whispered. "All these years, I thought I was alone. My mother never told me." Alexander nodded slowly, his eyes glistening. She protected you in her own way. But I swear to you, Emma, if I had known, I would have been there every day. I cannot change the past, but I can promise you this: you will never face the future alone." Her hand brushed against the necklace lying on the nightstand, its chain repaired overnight. It no longer felt a fragile relic. It felt like proof, a bridge between the life she had lost and the one she had just discovered. Later that day, Emma accompanied Alexander to his office, not as a guest, but as his daughter. The staff, usually composed and unshaken, whispered in awe as she entered. "That's her, the heiress. She looks just like him." Reporters camped outside the building, their cameras flashing as Emma stepped out of the sleek black car. But this time she wasn't shrinking from the attention. She walked with her head high, Alexander's steady hand guiding her forward. The world was no longer laughing at her humiliation, it was witnessing her transformation. Inside, Alexander introduced her formally to his board of directors. "This is my daughter, Emma Grant. From this day forward, she is part of this family and part of this legacy." Gasps filled the room, but no one dared to challenge him. Emma felt the weight of 1,000 eyes upon her, yet instead of fear, she felt strength. Her mother's words echoed in her mind. Never let go of this. Now she understood. The necklace had always been more than jewelry. It was destiny. Meanwhile, Richard sat alone in his penthouse, surrounded by silence. His phone buzzed with messages from investors, lawyers, and board members, but none brought good news. Every headline glorified Emma while dragging his name through the mud. He had mocked her necklace, belittled her love, struck her in arrogance, and now the world was watching him pay the price. For Emma, the path forward was no longer one of survival. It was a path of empowerment. She had found her voice, her family, and her place in a world that once tried to break her. And this was only the beginning. The headlines had been merciless for days. Stock prices plummeted, investors fled, and Richard's face was plastered across every newspaper as the man who had slapped his pregnant wife in public. But Richard was not ready to surrender. His arrogance had built empires, and now, even in ruin, he clung to the belief that he could still control the narrative. In his penthouse, surrounded by stacks of legal documents, Richard paced furiously. His lawyers sat stiffly at the table, trying to mask their discomfort. "I don't care what it takes," Richard barked. "I want everything kept quiet. We sue for defamation. We block the custody. Emma gets nothing." One of the lawyers cleared his throat carefully. "Sir, the problem is the evidence. There are dozens of videos, witnesses, the necklace, the billionaire's public declaration." "I don't care." Richard slammed his fist on the table, rattling the glasses. "She was mine, my wife, my property." The room went silent. Even his lawyers, paid to defend him, looked uneasy at the venom in his words. Meanwhile, in Alexander Grant's office, the atmosphere was entirely different. Emma sat across from a team of attorneys, their briefcases filled with documents, their voices calm but resolute. Alexander sat beside her, his presence commanding the room. "Emma," one lawyer explained, "we have overwhelming grounds. Evidence of physical abuse, public humiliation, infidelity, not to mention financial misconduct on Richard's part. You're entitled to custody, protection, and significant compensation." Emma swallowed hard. For years she had felt powerless, but now she was being told she had leverage. "I never wanted his money," she said quietly. "All I wanted was respect, safety for me and my child." Alexander placed a hand on hers. "You deserve both, and you'll have them." The first court hearing was unlike anything the city had seen. Reporters swarmed the courthouse steps. Protesters held signs reading "Justice for Emma" and "Protect women, not abusers." Inside, the gallery overflowed with onlookers eager to witness the downfall of a CEO. Richard arrived flanked by his lawyers, his expression hard but his eyes betraying sleepless nights. Emma entered moments later, her belly visible beneath a tailored dress, Alexander by her side. The contrast was stark. One man crumbling, one woman rising. The judge called the session to order. Richard's lawyers tried to paint Emma as manipulative, claiming she sought sympathy and wealth. But their arguments crumbled when the video of the slap was played. The sound of Richard's hand striking his wife echoed through the courtroom, followed by his sneer, "Good riddance." Gasps filled the room. Richard shifted uncomfortably, sweat forming on his brow. Then came the documents. Records of shell companies, hidden accounts, and fraudulent transfers. Alexander's legal team laid them out piece by piece, dismantling Richard's empire in front of him. "This isn't just about abuse," Alexander's lead attorney declared. "It's about betrayal, of a wife, of a child, of shareholders, and of the law itself." Richard's face turned ashen. He tried to interject, shouting, "She's lying! They're all lies!" But the judge's gavel silenced him. Emma sat quietly, her hands folded, her necklace glinting under the courtroom lights. For the first time, she didn't feel like prey. She felt like someone with power, someone who finally had the world on her side. By the end of the day, the judge ordered a freeze on Richard's assets, pending full investigation. Emma was granted immediate protection and temporary custody rights. Outside, cameras flashed as Emma stepped onto the courthouse steps. The crowd erupted in cheers. She looked into the sea of faces, her voice steady. "This isn't just about me. It's about every woman who's been silenced. Today, we spoke up." And for Richard, watching from the shadows, it was clear. His war was only beginning, but this time he was losing. Richard had always believed money was power. For years, he wore his wealth like armor, using it to silence critics, lure women, and bend others to his will. But now the armor was cracking, and piece by piece, it fell away. After the court froze his assets, the dominoes began to topple. Investors pulled out of his company, citing unacceptable risk. Banks demanded repayment of overdue loans. Suppliers refused to renew contracts. What had once been a thriving empire now looked like a castle built on sand, crumbling with every tide. Richard sat in his office, surrounded by empty chairs. The boardroom, once filled with eager executives, was silent. Those who had once sung his praises were gone, retreating to protect their own reputations. His phone buzzed nonstop, angry messages from shareholders, panicked calls from creditors, and headlines flashing across news sites. "CEO under fire." Richard Hayes' empire collapses. Mistress silent amid scandal. Everywhere he turned, doors were closing. At home, things were no better. Vanessa, who once clung to him like a jewel on display, now grew distant. She no longer laughed at his jokes or clung to his arm in public. Instead, she scrolled through her phone, answering calls from modeling agencies and wealthy admirers, eager to take advantage of her sudden notoriety. One evening, Richard cornered her in the penthouse kitchen. "You're still with me, aren't you?" he asked, his voice trembling with something he had never known before. Fear. Vanessa set her wine glass down, her expression cool. "With you?" "Richard, look at yourself. You've lost everything. Your company, your respect, even your dignity. What's left for me here?" His face contorted. "I gave you everything. Clothes, jewelry, luxury. You owe me." She tilted her head, her lips curling into a bitter smile. "You gave me things. But things don't last. And right now, you can't give me what I really want. Power, status. You're finished." The words struck harder than any blow. Richard staggered back, shaking his head in disbelief. "You can't leave me. Not now." But Vanessa had already turned away. "Watch me," she said coldly, gathering her handbag and walking out the door without looking back. Richard collapsed onto the leather sofa, the silence of the penthouse pressing down like a weight. For years, he had strutted through life believing no one could touch him. Now he sat alone, abandoned by the very woman he had chosen over his wife. Meanwhile, Emma's life was moving in the opposite direction. The public adored her, seeing her not as a victim, but as a symbol of strength. Interviews praised her composure in court. Editorials called her the unexpected heiress, a woman who endured humiliation and rose with dignity. Every headline that elevated Emma drove Richard deeper into despair. He flipped through news channels, throwing remotes and glasses at the screen. "She thinks she's won," he muttered to himself. "She thinks this is over, but it's not over." But no matter how loudly he raged, reality closed in. His accounts were drained, his properties seized, and his name dragged through the mud. The man who once had it all was now watching it all slip through his fingers, powerless to stop it. And for Emma, though she hadn't yet claimed victory, one truth was clear. Richard was unraveling, and soon, there would be nothing left of the man who once towered over her life. Emma had once lived in silence, her days spent shrinking under Richard's scorn. But those days were over. The world now knew her name, and Alexander Grant was determined to prepare her for the legacy she had inherited. Her mornings began early in the glass-walled conference rooms of Grant Tower. Instead of cooking breakfasts no one ate, or waiting alone in a cold apartment, Emma now sat at long tables surrounded by financial reports, graphs, and market forecasts. Alexander insisted she join every meeting, not as a spectator, but as a participant. "Knowledge is power, Emma," he told her firmly. "You've already endured what most couldn't survive. That resilience is your foundation. Now we build the rest." At first, Emma was overwhelmed. The language of business felt foreign. Profit margins, market shares, acquisitions. She scribbled notes furiously, staying up late to review them. Some executives doubted her. She saw it in their eyes, heard it in their whispers. "She's just a figurehead. A pretty story for the press." But Emma refused to back down. Every night, after the lights of Grant Tower dimmed, she studied alone, the necklace cool against her skin as if her mother were guiding her. She practiced speeches in the mirror, her voice trembling at first, then growing steady, strong. Alexander watched her with quiet pride. He had built an empire from nothing, but watching Emma grow into her own strength was a different kind of triumph. "You have more than my blood," he said one evening as they walked through the rooftop garden. "You have the spirit of a leader." Her transformation wasn't just professional. It was personal. Emma began carrying herself differently. The timid wife who once lowered her eyes was gone. She walked into rooms with her head held high, her steps measured, her gaze unwavering. Journalists who once pitied her now praised her elegance, dubbing her the heiress reborn. Meanwhile, Richard watched her rise from the shadows of his decline. Each news segment featuring Emma was another dagger. One evening, he hurled a glass at the television as she appeared in a tailored navy dress, addressing shareholders with confidence. "She's nothing without me," he screamed, though deep down, he knew the truth. She was everything without him. Emma's public debut came at an international finance summit. Cameras flashed as she stepped out of a sleek car, Alexander at her side. But it was Emma who drew the attention. Pregnant but radiant, she wore a flowing ivory gown that accentuated her strength rather than concealed her vulnerability. The necklace glittered under the spotlights, a symbol the entire world now recognized. When she took the stage, the audience hushed. Emma spoke of resilience, of building trust, of transforming pain into power. Her words weren't the polished rhetoric of a politician. They were raw, honest, and heartfelt. And that was why they resonated. By the end of her speech, the room erupted in applause. Headlines declared, "Emma Grant steals the show. Heiress wins over global leaders." Back at Grant Tower, Alexander embraced her, his eyes misty. "Your mother would be proud," he whispered. Emma smiled, her hand resting on her belly. For the first time in her life, she felt whole, not just as a daughter, not just as a mother-to-be, but as a woman who had reclaimed her worth. The world had tried to break her. Richard had tried to erase her. But Emma had risen, not just as a survivor, but as a leader, and this was only the beginning of her reign. Richard Hayes had never known how to lose. For decades, he had bulldozed competitors, silenced critics, and bought loyalty with his wealth. But now, stripped of his power, he paced his penthouse like a caged animal. The once pristine suite was littered with empty bottles and torn papers. His empire was gone, his mistress had abandoned him, and the woman he once controlled now stood taller than ever. But Richard's pride was not dead. It was feral, gnashing, and unwilling to vanish quietly. Late one night, he convened what remained of his inner circle: 2 shady lawyers, a PR consultant with trembling hands, and a private investigator with eyes too sharp to trust. Richard slammed his fist on the table. "I don't care if the world hates me," he growled. "I will not let Emma win. She humiliated me, ruined me. She thinks she's some heiress now? No, I'll tear her down before she destroys me." The investigator leaned forward. "There may be a way. Digging into her past, find something, anything that can discredit her." Richard's lips twisted into a bitter smile. "Yes, a scandal. That's what we need. If we can't destroy her now, we drag her name through the mud until no one wants to touch her." The plan was reckless, but Richard clung to it like a drowning man to driftwood. Meanwhile, Emma had no idea of the storm brewing. Her days were filled with preparations for motherhood and responsibilities at Grant Tower. She was learning faster than anyone expected, winning allies with her honesty and resilience. Yet sometimes at night, doubt still crept in. Could she really stand against Richard forever? Or would he find some way to pull her back into the shadows? Her father noticed her unease. One evening, as they sat in the quiet glow of the rooftop garden, Alexander spoke gently. "Fear is natural, Emma. But remember this, Richard's strength was never his own. It was borrowed, from money, from power, from the people he controlled. Once those are gone, he is nothing." Emma touched her necklace, feeling its weight against her skin. "I'm not the same woman I was," she said softly. "He can't hurt me anymore." But Richard was already moving. He leaked stories to gossip magazines, painting Emma as manipulative, suggesting she had trapped him into marriage, hinting that her pregnancy wasn't even his. He bribed tabloids to run photos taken years ago, twisting innocent moments into something sordid. For a few days, the headlines were brutal. Heiress or opportunist, Emma's secret past. Richard smirked as he threw the tabloids, convinced he had regained control. But what he hadn't counted on was Emma's transformation. She didn't hide. She didn't cower. Instead, she faced the cameras head-on. Standing at the steps of Grant Tower, her voice steady, she declared, "These lies are nothing compared to the truth I live every day. The truth is that I endured abuse, humiliation, and betrayal. I will not apologize for surviving. I will not apologize for protecting my child." The world rallied around her. Hashtags trended again. Stand with Emma. Truth over lies. Each attempt Richard made to smear her only painted him darker in the public eye. In his penthouse, Richard smashed the tabloids in rage. "Why isn't it working?" he shouted. "Why won't she break?" Because Emma wasn't his victim anymore. She was his reckoning. The smear campaign had failed. Richard's desperate attempts to tarnish Emma's name had only backfired, strengthening her image as a survivor who refused to be silenced. But Emma knew he wasn't finished. A man like Richard would cling to vengeance until his last breath. And so she prepared. At Grant Tower, her schedule shifted from learning to leading. Alexander insisted she not only sit in on meetings, but take charge of them. "If you're going to inherit this empire, you must know how to defend it," he told her. Not just from competitors, but from men like Richard. Emma dove into the work. She studied corporate law, finance, and public relations, but more than anything, she studied Richard. She knew his weaknesses now, not just greed and pride, but the crippling fear of losing control. That fear was her weapon. One evening, Alexander gathered his legal team in the grand boardroom. Emma sat at the head of the table, her necklace glinting under the lights. The lead attorney spread out documents like cards in a winning hand. "We've uncovered more," he announced. "Shell companies, fraudulent transfers, hidden debts. Richard Hayes is sitting on a minefield of crimes. The moment we file these charges, his career and his freedom are finished." Emma's hands trembled slightly as she sifted through the papers. Years ago, she would have recoiled at words like fraud and embezzlement. Now she saw them for what they were, chains Richard had forged for himself. "Are you ready for this?" Alexander asked, his eyes steady on hers. Emma took a breath, placing a hand on her belly. "For me, for my child, for every woman he's ever belittled. Yes, I'm ready." The next weeks became a montage of preparation. Emma practiced speeches in front of mirrors, rehearsed courtroom testimonies with lawyers, and attended galas, not as Richard's shadow, but as her father's heir. She wore gowns chosen not for Richard's approval, but for her own confidence. Bold colors, elegant lines, and always the necklace, her mother's legacy, the symbol of her survival. Public support swelled around her. Fan pages dedicated to her resilience appeared online. Women sent her letters, sharing their own stories of abuse and betrayal. "You're giving us hope," one letter read. Emma cried as she read it, realizing that her pain had become more than her own. It had become a beacon. Richard, meanwhile, was unraveling faster than ever. Each time he tried to strike back, Emma countered calmly, with evidence, with grace, with truth. He stormed through his empty office, shouting at aides who no longer listened, throwing files across the floor. The more he raged, the weaker he appeared. The media began calling it the final battle. Emma, the heiress who rose from humiliation, versus Richard, the disgraced CEO clinging to the last scraps of power. One night, standing on the balcony of Grant Tower, Emma looked out at the city lights. The necklace gleamed in the moonlight, a reminder of where she had come from. She whispered softly, as if to her mother, "I'm not afraid anymore." Alexander stepped out beside her, placing a supportive hand on her shoulder. "Tomorrow begins the end," he said, And this time, Emma, you won't just survive, you'll win." Emma straightened, her heart steady. She had once been a silent wife, invisible and unheard, but now she was ready for war. And Richard Hayes, for all his bluster and pride, had no idea just how powerful the woman he once called weak had become. The courthouse buzzed with anticipation. Reporters crowded the marble steps, their cameras flashing in the morning sun. Protesters held signs demanding justice, their chants echoing through the streets. "Stand with Emma. Protect the innocent." Inside, the tension was suffocating. The courtroom was packed, every seat filled with spectators, journalists, and curious onlookers. At the front, the judge adjusted his glasses, glancing over the files stacked high on his bench. Richard sat at the defendant's table, his once impeccable suit wrinkled, his tie askew. His eyes darted around the room, restless, anxious. He no longer looked like a powerful CEO. He looked like a man cornered. Across from him, Emma entered the courtroom. Her steps steady, her belly visible beneath a tailored dress. She wore no diamonds, no flashy adornments, only her mother's necklace, gleaming under the lights. Alexander walked beside her, his presence a fortress of strength. The room fell silent as she took her seat. The trial began with Richard's lawyers attempting to salvage his reputation. They painted him as a misunderstood husband, a victim of media exaggeration. They argued that Emma's pregnancy had made her overly emotional, and that her father was manipulating the narrative for financial gain. But their words crumbled the moment the prosecution played the video. The screen lit up with the scene from the restaurant. Richard's hand striking Emma, the necklace snapping, Alexander's voice declaring, "She is my daughter." The sound echoed through the chamber. Gasps rose from the audience. Richard shifted uncomfortably, sweat beading at his temples. His lawyers avoided his gaze, their arguments dissolving into ash. Next came the documents, proof of fraud, embezzlement, and hidden accounts. Page after page was laid bare, showing how Richard had siphoned money from investors to fund his lavish lifestyle and Vanessa's luxuries. Each exhibit struck another blow to his defense. When it was Emma's turn to testify, the room leaned forward. She stood, her voice calm but resolute. "For years," she began, "I lived in silence. I believed I was worthless because that's what Richard made me believe. I thought if I stayed quiet, if I obeyed, maybe he'd show me kindness. But silence doesn't stop cruelty, it feeds it. That night at the restaurant, he tried to break me in front of the world, but instead, the truth broke him." Her words rang with a quiet power that silenced even Richard's sneer. She looked directly at him, not with fear but with clarity. "You mocked me for wearing this necklace. You called it worthless. But it was never worthless. It carried the truth of who I am, and now that truth has set me free." The gallery erupted in applause before the judge restored order. In his closing arguments, Alexander's lead attorney drove the final nail into Richard's coffin. This is not just a case about fraud. It is not just about abuse. It is about justice. Emma Hayes, now Emma Grant, has endured years of humiliation and cruelty. Today, this court has the chance to send a message. No man, no matter how rich, stands above the law. The judge's gavel struck. The verdict was read. Richard Hayes was guilty of financial crimes, abuse, and fraud. His assets would be seized, his company dissolved, and he faced years behind bars. Richard's face went pale. His mouth opened as if to protest, but no words came. The courtroom buzzed with relief and triumph. Emma closed her eyes, a tear sliding down her cheek, not of pain, but of release. The nightmare was over. She had faced him, and she had won. The verdict had been delivered, and Richard's empire was nothing but rubble. Yet for Emma, the end of one chapter was the beginning of another. She had not fought so hard only to live in her father's shadow. She was determined to create a legacy of her own. Grant Tower became her new battlefield. No longer the timid woman who once stood silently in the background, Emma now walked into boardrooms with authority. Her presence carried weight. Her words, once hesitant, now rang with conviction. Executives who had doubted her before began to lean forward when she spoke. In her first meeting as Alexander's officially recognized daughter and heir, Emma addressed the board. "For years I was told I was weak, that my worth came from the man I married. But today I know the truth. Strength comes from survival, from resilience, from the courage to rebuild. And that is what I intend to do, not just for myself, but for this company." The room erupted in applause. Even the most skeptical directors nodded in agreement. Emma wasn't just a name attached to a fortune, she was a force. Her transformation caught the attention of the media. News outlets that once pitied her now hailed her as a symbol of empowerment. Emma Grant, from humiliation to leadership, read one headline. Another praised her as the new face of resilient women in business. But Emma's ambitions went beyond reputation. She wanted to use her influence for good. With Alexander's blessing, she launched initiatives to support women and children facing abuse, funding shelters, legal aid, and educational programs. Each announcement sent shockwaves across the nation. She wasn't just inheriting wealth, she was using it to change lives. Still, the journey wasn't easy. Some rivals whispered that she was inexperienced, that her rise was built only on her father's name. Emma heard their doubts, but instead of shrinking, she answered with action. She stayed late in the office, mastering the intricacies of finance and law. She met with employees on the ground, listening to their concerns, proving she wasn't just another figurehead. Her father watched with pride. One evening, as they shared dinner in his penthouse, Alexander spoke softly. "You remind me of your mother," he said. "She had the same fire, the same compassion. I built an empire of steel and glass, Emma. But you are building one of people and purpose." Emma smiled, her hand resting on her belly. "I want my child to grow up in a world where strength doesn't mean cruelty, where power is used to protect, not to destroy." Meanwhile, Richard sat in a prison cell awaiting sentencing. Newspapers no longer called him a titan. He was a cautionary tale, a fallen man who had destroyed himself with greed and arrogance. And though Emma never visited him, his name no longer haunted her nights. He was part of her past, not her future. Emma's future was radiant. She attended her first international business summit as co-leader of Grant Industries. Cameras flashed as she entered, glowing with confidence. She spoke not of profits and losses, but of integrity, resilience, and legacy. By the time she finished, even her fiercest critics were forced to acknowledge her power. As she stood on stage, necklace glittering under the spotlights, Emma realized something profound. She was no longer the woman defined by betrayal and pain. She was the woman who had transformed them into strength. And this was only the beginning of her reign as the heiress who turned survival into leadership. It had been months since the verdict that sealed Richard's downfall. Emma had risen higher with each passing week, praised in headlines, celebrated at international summits, and admired for the foundation she built in her mother's honor. But fate had one last scene to play. It happened on a crisp autumn evening at a charity gala hosted at the Grand Regent Hotel. The ballroom glittered with chandeliers and crystal glasses, its stage set for donors and dignitaries. Emma, radiant in an emerald gown that accentuated her growing belly, stepped through the entrance with Alexander at her side. Cameras flashed, and the crowd erupted in whispers. She was no longer the humiliated wife. They all saw her now as the heiress who had triumphed. As she greeted guests, a stir rippled through the room. Richard had arrived. He was thinner, his once proud frame slouched, his suit ill-fitting. Flanked not by lawyers or admirers, but by whispers and stares, he walked with the stiffness of a man clinging to the last fragments of pride. And beside him, in a dress that no longer sparkled as it once did, was Vanessa. Her beauty seemed brittle, her smile forced. She clutched his arm, but not with affection, with desperation. The crowd parted as the two couples drew closer. Conversations faltered, the air electric with anticipation. Everyone knew they were about to witness something unforgettable. Emma stopped, her gaze steady as Richard approached. Their eyes met, hers calm, his burning with resentment. "Well," Richard sneered, forcing a laugh. "Look at you, playing princess now? Do you really think all this applause means you belong here?" Emma tilted her head, her voice gentle but firm. "No, Richard, I don't need applause to belong here. I belong because I survived you." The words landed like a slap sharper than any he had given her before. Gasps echoed through the ballroom. Vanessa stepped forward, her voice dripping with venom. "Don't act so high and mighty, Emma. You were nothing before Richard. Without him, you'd still be?" "Still be what?" Emma interrupted softly, her necklace catching the light. "Still be a woman who believed in loyalty? Still be someone who thought love was enough? Yes, I was those things. But now, I am something you'll never be, free." The silence that followed was deafening. Richard's jaw clenched, but his words failed him. Vanessa's smile faltered, her hand slipping from his arm. The truth of their collapse was written across their faces. Alexander stepped beside his daughter, his voice deep and commanding. "This conversation is over. My daughter owes you nothing, not your scorn, not your attention, not even her anger." The crowd erupted in applause, not for Richard, not for Vanessa, but for Emma. Cameras flashed, capturing the moment. The heiress standing tall, the disgraced CEO and his mistress shrinking in her shadow. Emma didn't gloat. She didn't raise her voice. She simply turned, her hand resting on her belly, and walked away with the grace of a woman who had reclaimed her life. Behind her, Richard's shoulders sagged, the last of his pride crumbling. Vanessa looked at him with contempt, already scanning the room for someone new to cling to. For Emma, the final encounter was not about revenge. It was about closure. She had faced the people who once tried to destroy her, and she had walked away unbroken. The past was behind her. The future was hers to shape. And the world now knew. Emma Grant was not just a survivor. She was unstoppable. The storm had passed, and the skies of Emma's life finally began to clear. For years she had lived in shadows, silenced, humiliated, broken down by Richard's cruelty. Now she stood in the light, stronger than ever, ready for the next chapter. That chapter arrived in the form of a newborn's cry. On a bright spring morning, Emma gave birth to a healthy baby boy. The hospital room, filled with sunlight and flowers sent by well-wishers, felt nothing like the cold emptiness of her old life. As she held her son for the first time, tears streamed down her cheeks. She whispered softly, "You will never know the pain I did. You will only know love." Alexander stood by the window, his eyes glistening as he watched his daughter cradle his grandson. "He has your strength," he said, his voice thick with emotion, "and his mother's fire." Emma smiled, exhausted but radiant. The necklace rested against her chest, its pendant brushing the baby's tiny hand. It no longer felt like a burden from the past. It felt like a promise for the future. News of the child's birth spread quickly. Headlines declared, "Heiress Emma Grant welcomes son." The next generation of the Grant legacy. Crowds gathered outside the hospital, cheering as Alexander addressed them briefly. "This child will grow up surrounded by love, protected from cruelty, and raised to understand the responsibility of legacy." Back in his prison cell, Richard read the headlines with shaking hands. The photos of Emma glowing with her child were salt in his wounds. He slammed the paper against the wall, but the sound of his cell door clanging shut reminded him of the truth. His world was gone. Emma had moved on, and she had everything he had tried to deny her. Meanwhile, Emma embraced motherhood with the same determination she had shown in the courtroom. Nights were sleepless, days were exhausting, but each time she looked into her son's eyes, she felt stronger. She attended board meetings with him swaddled at her side, a living testament that strength and tenderness could coexist. Critics whispered that motherhood might slow her rise, but Emma proved them wrong. She delegated wisely, balanced her time, and leaned on Alexander's unwavering support. The Grant Foundation expanded, opening new shelters and launching programs for single mothers. Emma gave speeches not just as a leader, but as a mother who understood the struggles of women everywhere. Her words resonated deeply. "My son will grow up knowing that true power is not in domination, but in compassion, and I will make sure every child, every mother, has the chance to stand tall as we do." At her first public event after the baby's birth, Emma stepped onto the stage in a simple gown, her child nestled in her arms. The crowd erupted in cheers, cameras flashing. She didn't speak of numbers or profits. She spoke of hope, of building a world where no woman had to endure what she had endured. As she finished, Alexander joined her on stage, placing a proud hand on her shoulder. 3 generations, grandfather, mother, and child, stood together as living proof that no cruelty, no betrayal could destroy a legacy built on resilience. Emma looked out at the crowd, her son resting peacefully against her heart. She had been broken, but she had rebuilt herself stronger. She had been silenced, but now her voice carried across nations. Her story was no longer about survival. It was about legacy. And this time, it was only the beginning. Emma's story had already captured her city, but Alexander often reminded her, "True legacy isn't local, Emma. It's global. If you want to change lives, you must step beyond borders." And so she did. Her first major step came with the International Women's Leadership Forum in Geneva. Delegates from 50 countries attended, representing governments, corporations, and humanitarian organizations. When Emma walked into the grand hall, dressed in a simple ivory gown, cameras from every corner of the globe turned her way. She wasn't there as a victim of abuse. She was there as a leader with a mission. Her speech was unlike the polished, scripted addresses that usually filled such forums. Emma spoke from the heart. She told her story, not in graphic detail, but with honesty. She spoke of betrayal, of humiliation, of surviving cruelty and rising stronger. Her words carried more weight than statistics ever could. I stand before you not as someone who was saved by privilege, but as someone who fought through pain and found strength in truth. And I believe every woman, no matter her circumstance, deserves the chance to rise. The hall erupted in a standing ovation. Leaders approached her afterward, offering partnerships and pledges. Within weeks, the Grant Foundation expanded internationally, collaborating with European shelters, Asian nonprofits, and African women's cooperatives. Emma traveled tirelessly, her son often accompanying her, cradled in her arms on private flights or sleeping peacefully in her hotel suite. To the world, the image of a powerful heiress balancing motherhood and leadership was magnetic. Photos of her addressing parliaments with her child nearby went viral, sparking conversations about redefining strength and success. Of course, not everyone celebrated her rise. Critics accused her of using her personal tragedy for fame. Others whispered she was inexperienced, propped up by her father's wealth. But Emma countered with results. Each project she launched brought measurable change. Shelters built, schools opened, jobs created. Doubt faded when people saw action. Meanwhile, Richard's shadow shrank further. His appeals were denied, his wealth drained, and his name forgotten in serious circles. On the rare occasions tabloids mentioned him, it was as a cautionary tale. The world's attention had shifted. Emma was no longer seen in relation to him. She was Emma Grant, in her own right. Back home, Alexander watched proudly as headlines praised his daughter. Yet one evening, as they sat together in the quiet of the Grant estate, he offered gentle advice. The world can lift you up, Emma, but it can also turn quickly. Never let applause define you. Let your purpose define you. Emma nodded, gazing down at her sleeping son. I don't want fame for myself. I want safety for him, for every child like him. That's my purpose. Her next move was bolder still. She announced a global summit in New York, inviting leaders, activists, and survivors to share the stage. The theme, turning pain into power. Invitations alone sent shockwaves across industries. Everyone wanted to be part of Emma's vision. As the date approached, anticipation built. The world didn't just want to watch Emma anymore, they wanted to follow her. Standing in her office, overlooking the city lights, Emma touched her necklace. It no longer represented the love her mother had lost. Now, it symbolized the love and legacy she was building for the future. The journey that began in humiliation was now shaping the world. And Emma knew this was not her peak. It was only the next step. The Global Summit on Resilience was unlike anything the world had seen. Leaders, activists, survivors, and CEOs filled the vast New York auditorium. The stage gleamed beneath lights, banners draped with the words, "Turning pain into power." And at the center of it all stood Emma. She wore a flowing white gown that radiated both grace and strength, her necklace catching the glow of the spotlights. Beside the podium sat her infant son, resting peacefully in a cradle, the living proof of everything she had fought for. Behind her, Alexander watched with quiet pride, knowing this moment belonged entirely to her. When Emma stepped to the microphone, the room fell silent. I once believed silence would keep me safe, she began, her voice steady, resonating through the hall. But silence only fed cruelty. For years I was humiliated, belittled, and struck down. And then, in one moment, the truth revealed itself. A necklace, a name, a father, and a second chance. I stand here today not as a victim, but as a survivor. Not just as a survivor, but as a leader. The audience leaned forward, captivated. Emma raised her chin, her voice growing stronger. My message is simple. Pain does not define us. Betrayal does not break us. Every wound can become strength. Every fall can become a rise. We do not turn away from what hurt us. We turn it into power. That is how we change the world. Thunderous applause erupted, echoing like a wave through the hall. Delegates rose to their feet, clapping, cheering, some with tears streaming down their faces. Cameras captured the moment, broadcasting it live to millions around the globe. Emma's words didn't just inspire, they ignited action. By the end of the summit, governments pledged millions to support women's shelters, corporations promised reforms, and survivors who had once felt voiceless stood taller, emboldened by her story. For Emma, the victory was not about applause or headlines. It was about healing. That night, as the city lights twinkled outside the Grant estate, she stood on the balcony with her father. Her son slept inside, the necklace now resting on his blanket like a blessing passed through generations. "You've done more than I ever dreamed," Alexander said softly. "You didn't just rise, Emma. You lifted the world with you." Emma smiled, her eyes glistening. "This was never about revenge. It was about breaking the cycle. My son will never grow up in fear, and neither should any child." Far away, Richard sat in his prison cell, a shadow of the man he once was. The news broadcast played faintly from a guard's television, Emma's face glowing, her words echoing through the walls. He turned away, unable to watch. The world had moved on without him, he was forgotten. But Emma's story would never be forgotten. Months later, a bronze statue was unveiled outside Grant Tower. A woman standing tall, one hand resting on her heart, the other holding a small child. At the base were inscribed the words Emma had spoken at the summit. "Every wound can become strength. Every fall can become a rise." Crowds gathered daily to see it, to remember, to be inspired. For generations to come, her journey would serve as proof that dignity could triumph over cruelty, that love could outlast betrayal, and that legacies are built not from power, but from compassion. Emma Grant had once been silenced. Now her voice would echo forever. Years had passed since the night Emma stood on the global stage and declared her truth. The world had moved forward, but her name still carried weight in boardrooms, in shelters, and in homes where women and children whispered her story as inspiration. The Grant Foundation had grown into an international force. What began as a single initiative in her city had expanded to over 40 countries. Shelters stood where once there had been none. Schools flourished in places where education for girls had been little more than a dream. Survivors found not only safety, but opportunities to thrive. Each of these victories bore Emma's mark. Her son, now a bright-eyed boy with the same determined gaze as his mother, often accompanied her to events. He would tug at her hand during speeches, giggle when cameras flashed, and sometimes climb into her lap as she addressed world leaders. The image of a powerful heiress balancing motherhood with global leadership never failed to capture hearts. To many, Emma was proof that strength and tenderness could coexist. At home, Emma embraced a quieter side of life. Evenings were spent reading to her son, cooking simple meals, and laughing with Alexander, whose health had grown frailer with age, but whose pride in his daughter never dimmed. "You've done what I could not," he told her once as they watched the sunset from the balcony. "I built an empire of stone. You built an empire of hope." Yet Emma never forgot where she came from. On anniversaries, she visited her mother's grave, placing fresh flowers and whispering updates about her life. She would touch her necklace, the same necklace that once fell to the restaurant floor, and smile through tears. "I kept your promise, Mama. I turned the pain into strength." Meanwhile, Richard faded into obscurity. After his release from prison, he lived quietly, stripped of wealth, status, and the adoration he once demanded. The tabloids no longer cared for him. The world had long since moved on. Sometimes, he glimpsed Emma's face on television, radiant and powerful, and the weight of his mistakes pressed harder than prison walls ever had. He had tried to break her, but she had become unbreakable. The final chapter of Emma's legacy came one spring afternoon at Grant Tower. A new wing of the foundation was unveiled, dedicated to survivors of domestic violence. The atrium was filled with guests, journalists, and families whose lives had been touched by her work. Emma stood at the podium, her son beside her, now old enough to understand pieces of her story. She spoke not of wealth or power, but of healing. "We are not defined by what broke us," she said, her voice carrying through the hall. "We are defined by how we rise. My journey began with silence, but it ends with voices, millions of voices, lifting each other up. That is my legacy, and it is yours too." The audience rose to their feet in thunderous applause. Tears glistened in the eyes of women who had once been voiceless, now standing tall because of her. As Emma stepped down, her son tugged her hand and whispered, "Mama, are you a hero?" She knelt to meet his eyes, smiling softly. "No, sweetheart, I'm just someone who refused to stay silent. The real heroes are all around us, the ones who rise no matter how many times they fall." And with that, Emma Grant's story closed, not with revenge, but with hope. A legacy destined to echo through generations. Time had a way of softening memories, but Emma's story never faded. It was retold in classrooms, quoted in boardrooms, and remembered in shelters where women whispered her name like a prayer. The once broken wife who rose as a billionaire's daughter had become something far greater, an icon of resilience. Years passed. Alexander, her steadfast father, eventually grew too frail to attend meetings. In his final days, he called Emma to his side. His voice was weak, but his eyes still burned with pride. "You carried the name Grant higher than I ever could," he told her, gripping her hand. "But more importantly, you carried hope. When I am gone, do not mourn, build higher." When he passed peacefully that night, Emma stood before thousands at his memorial. She didn't speak of his wealth or empire. She spoke of the love he had given her when she needed it most. "He found me when I thought I was lost," she said, her voice breaking but strong. "And because of him, I learned to rise." The crowd rose in applause, honoring not just Alexander, but the daughter who had carried his legacy forward. Emma continued her work, but her role gradually shifted. She no longer had to fight for recognition. She had already earned it. Now she focused on mentoring the next generation. Universities invited her to lecture. Young women sought her guidance. Survivors turned leaders credited her foundation for their success. Emma had become the mentor she once needed. Her son grew quickly, inheriting his mother's fierce determination and his grandfather's keen mind. By his teenage years, he was already speaking at youth summits, his words echoing with the same clarity that had once shaken courtrooms. Standing at her side, he reminded Emma of how far they had come. One evening, they walked together through the plaza outside Grant Tower. The bronze statue of Emma holding a child gleamed under the streetlights, its inscription still drawing crowds. "Every wound can become strength, every fall can become a rise." "Do you ever think about the past?" her son asked. Emma paused, touching the necklace that still rested at her throat. "Every day," she admitted, "but not with fear anymore, with gratitude. Because without the past, we wouldn't have this future." He studied her, then said softly, "Someday I'll take your place." Emma smiled, her heart swelling. "And when you do, you'll build even higher than I ever could." The final passing of the torch came at a global summit in New York, years after Emma first stood there trembling with doubt. This time she stood with confidence, her son beside her as a co-speaker. The crowd roared as they took the stage together, a living testament to resilience carried through generations. Emma addressed the audience one last time as the world's eyes turned to her. "My journey began in silence and pain, but today I stand in a world where my son can speak without fear, where children everywhere can dream without limits. That is the legacy we must leave. Not wealth, not power, but hope." Then she stepped back, allowing her son to take the microphone. His voice rang strong, steady, and full of promise. And in that moment, Emma knew her story had come full circle. She had survived betrayal, she had risen from humiliation, she had built a legacy from ashes, and now she had ensured it would never die. So that's how the story ends, my friends. And if you're still here with me right now, it probably means something inside this story has touched your heart. You see, life is full of betrayal, pain, and storms we never asked for. But as Marcus Aurelius once said, what stands in the way becomes the way. Every wound, every fall, can be turned into strength if we choose to rise again. Emma's journey is not just her story. It's a reminder that no matter how broken we feel, there is always a path to healing, to purpose, to legacy. So if this touched you in any way, do me one favor. Like this video, share it with someone who needs it, and subscribe to our channel. Let's keep walking this path of resilience together.